All right, welcome everybody to our 242nd episode of the Minnesota Outdoor Skills and Stewardship Series. We have a fun one today, an animal that a lot of people connect with in different ways across Minnesota, the Minnesota moose. So we're joined by Dr. Amanda McGraw today, new to the DNR, fairly new to the DNR, and leading some of our moose research projects. So Amanda, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Hello, everyone, and thanks, Benji, for the introduction. As you mentioned, my name is Amanda McGraw. I'm the state's moose, elk, and deer scientist based out of Grand Rapids with the DNR. And I've been with DNR for about a year and a half now, diving right into some ongoing moose research and really enjoying that. So I'm excited to talk to everyone about Minnesota moose and what's been going on with them over the past decades and current research projects that have kicked off in the last year. So getting us started, I just have a little bit of an outline here for how the talk is going to go today. I'm going to start with some basic moose biology, just give everyone an overview about moose in general. You might remember parts of this from a webinar that Dr. Michelle Carstensen gave on moose a couple years ago, but it doesn't hurt to give a refresher. Then I'll move into some recent moose research and monitoring history, starting with our aerial survey that we do annually. Talk about some cause-specific mortality studies that have been done in response to population declines over the past couple decades, and some investigations we've done into weather and climate impacts on survival and behavior of our moose. And then I'm going to dive into some of the new research and management that is going on with moose over the past year, specifically our juvenile recruitment and fecundity study that kicked off last winter. So looking at how these moose do becoming adults and first-time parents. And then I want to end with touching on a really exciting new tool that we're adding to our toolbox over the past year or so that aids us in these research efforts. So I also want to point out that that new tool is a Cessna 206 airplane with a thermal infrared camera platform. And so the background picture here on this slide is showing moose that are about to be captured and collared for a new juvenile study. And they're in that kind of thermal infrared mode in the camera. So we have a cow and her calves following her. Those calves were collared and they are in our study currently. So like I said, we're going to start with a little bit of Moose 101. They are our largest species within the deer family. We have 3 of those species that occur within Minnesota and have established populations here. That being the moose, largest in the world, largest in Minnesota, because it's the largest in the world. And then we also have elk and whitetail deer. So this is just a slide that gives you a little bit of a frame of reference for just how large these critters are. On average in Minnesota, our moose weigh about 800 to 1,000 pounds, but they can get larger. The lifespan of a moose in the wild is about 15 to 20 years, so kind of long-lived for a large deer. They have a gestation period of about 8 months, and they tend to give birth in a week or two around May 15th. That's when we see our peak calving. Some birds occur beyond those windows, but the majority of calves are born in those two or 3 weeks around May 15th. They typically have 1 or 2 calves, so a 30% twinning rate is generally considered pretty good, healthy population. And occasionally you'll see triplets born, these moose, but that's pretty rare. They are what we call a generalist herbivore, so they eat a wide variety of shrubs, woody species, and aquatic vegetation. And in fact, the Algonquin word for moose, which is how moose got their English name, is moose, which roughly translates into twig eater. Moose have to eat a lot of vegetation per day. They are a large-bodied animal, so about 73 pounds of vegetation per day. And if anyone is a great outdoors fan, that's about 12 old 96ers. So I'm not sure Chet would be going back for a dessert after finishing the equivalent of 12 giant steaks if he was a moose. But that's what they need to be healthy and maintain, good health per day. So that's a lot of food. Moose are also really well adapted to cold temperatures. They have a thick hide, they have hollow guard hairs that trap air and really do a really good job of insulating them against cold temperatures. So it's like wearing a really thick base layer out there and covering it with a puffy coat that has a lot of air. It keeps you really, really warm. But they're living in highly seasonal environments, and so they often don't do as well in warmer temperatures. And a way to mitigate some of those warm temperature extremes that they experience, they can do things like alter their behavior and utilize different habitats. I'm going to dive into this a little bit more later on and touch on some of our current research that is just wrapping up on what these moose are doing when they're hot. So it makes sense that moose are cold adapted. They are what we would call a circumboreal species. So they live around the world where we tend to see boreal forest habitats. There are moose in Asia and parts of Europe. There are about 4 subspecies. They're called the European type in Asia and Europe here. So this figure I'm showing of the globe is kind of a top-down look from the North Pole area. So we see parts of Asia and Europe here where my cursor is. And then we also see the American subtypes of moose, which we have about 4 subspecies in the United States and Canada, mostly again following that boreal and mixed forest ecotones. So when did moose arrive in North America? Well, it's believed they crossed the Bering Land Bridge like many species did when that land was exposed. And then following the recession of the glacial ice sheets and the development of boreal and mixed forests, they dispersed across North America, colonized those forests over the last 12 to 4,000 years ago. And then for the last 3,000 years or so, they have generally had range stabilization with some shifts along the margins. Here we have a map of where the 4 different subspecies occur across North America. So again, mostly within Canada and some of the northern United States, including Minnesota. But then we also have the Shiras moose, which is a subspecies of moose that tends to occur along the Rocky Mountain Range into the United States and in the Colorado Plateau. The subspecies that we have in Minnesota is called Alces andersoni. And again, here I'm showing their kind of colonization across, but also how that matches this other map in the corner that shows where boreal forest zones and mixed forest zones occur. So pretty well matching that distribution. So as I mentioned, their core range across the North American continent has pretty much been stable over the past several thousand years. However, we've seen some shifts at the margins. And so this is a series of maps that show just how their primary range within Minnesota has shifted from pre-settlement and settlement area, where you see this dark green on the map that's in your top left corner in north and north central Minnesota. And then post-settlement, after we've seen a significant land use changes and movement of deer and whatnot into certain areas as a result of that, you see moose range kind of shift and become fairly stable across northern Minnesota, but with small changes in that northern Minnesota distribution as we get into the 80s, where we see quite a few moose in northwest Minnesota and also northeast Minnesota, but fewer in that kind of central northern range. And then finally ending with the mid 2000s onward, where we have a core moose range that we're going to focus on mostly today, found in northeast Minnesota and what we refer to commonly as the Arrowhead region. And so again, these maps are showing in dark green primary range, so core range for moose over time, and lighter green is our secondary range, and then gray would be considered not part of core moose range, but that doesn't mean we don't see moose traveling outside of their core and secondary ranges. So we do get sightings all over the state. These just indicate where you're primarily going to find moose across Minnesota. Okay, so that's kind of Moose 101, where they are now in Minnesota. And now I want to dive into some of the research and monitoring that we do to try and maintain healthy moose populations across the state and understand, when and why some of these populations or our current population is maybe not healthy and what we can do to improve habitat and health of them for moose. So I just wanted to point out that today I'm going to focus on DNR and co-led research and monitoring, but also recognize that we are not the only game in town. There are plenty of folks represented here on this slide, and some that probably aren't, that are also doing moose research within Minnesota. A lot of our work tends to be collaborative amongst these groups. So for instance, our annual moose survey is a full partnership with 1854 Treaty Authority and Fond du Lac Band. And we also have a new research project that I'm going to talk about later on in this presentation that is co-led by Dr. Michelle Carsonson, Minnesota DNR, and also Morgan Swingen with 1854 Treaty Authority and kind of a co-stewardship framework. And also that study has partners that include Grand Portage and the University of Minnesota Duluth. And so there's a lot of work being done for moose. This is just touching on the folks that are doing surveys and research at the moment, but it's not touching on the whole host of agencies and other NGOs and universities that are currently doing a lot of collaborative habitat management. I just don't have time to cover all of it today, but know that there, beyond research, there is active management going on, and at a landscape level that involves the whole suite of folks that are included on this slide, but others that are not. So as I mentioned, we do an annual survey for moose in Minnesota. This is a figure that shows a brief history of what those surveys look like. We've been doing them annually since about 1960 and consistently. So we've, excuse me, done an annual survey of our Northeast moose population consistently from 1959, 1960 to present. Those survey population estimates are indicated with the black line in the open black circles. I would also point out here that in about the 2005, 2006 era, we switched from surveying moose in Northeast Minnesota with airplanes to surveying them with helicopters. That caused a change in methodology and the way we observe moose, such that it is really difficult, if not impossible, to compare population estimates in the Northeast when we were doing the aerial survey with airplanes to now when we're doing it with helicopters. And so I just want to make sure that folks recognize that the population estimates in the white part of the figure are not necessarily an apples to apples comparison to the population estimates shown in the green part of the figure for the survey that's done in Northeast Minnesota. Now, the blue indicated here on the graph is representing the aerial survey that we used to do for the population in Northwest Minnesota. We stopped doing that survey in 2007, but I'll explain why in a second. I just want to point out before we get there, though, that the blue lines represent Northwest moose surveys. The open circles are the prairie forest survey. And then when you see the open triangle, it represents the prairie part of the survey, and closed triangles equal the forest part of the survey. So there was a switch in the survey there that separated out different components of that Northwest population. All right. So this is what our surveyed area currently looks like in Northeast Minnesota. We have about 435 blocks that occur within this core range. And every year we sample about 10% of those blocks. And we do what's called a stratified sample, in that each of those blocks are categorized as having either high, medium, or low density of moose. And so the proportion of blocks sampled represent how many of the high, medium, and low blocks occur throughout that 435 within core moose range. So annually, we fly about 43 of these, and they are either high, medium, or low density. And that changes every year. It's random draw. So then we also have 10 plots that are flown annually and that are not randomized. They are called our habitat plots. They are the cross-hatching here on the map. Those are flown all the time. They're not randomly selected, and they are centered over areas where we've seen some level of landscape change in the recent past that we think would lend itself to an improved habitat for these moose. So that could be natural disturbance on those blocks, such as blowdown that was experienced in the boundary waters, or wildfires, in addition to large-scale management for the benefit of moose. So those, again, get flown every year, while the rest are in a pool that gets randomly sampled every year. So here, the shaded blocks indicating blocks that were flown in last year's survey. All right. So there's a lot of good reasons to do annual aerial surveys for moose. It is efficient to fly these aerial surveys for big critters like moose that tend to live in remote, difficult to access, large areas, and at relatively low densities. So these surveys help us estimate populations. As you know, it also, in a hunted population, they can be used to help with regulatory decisions, such as how many tags to allocate on an annual basis and whatnot. It also helps us get a view of the population trends over time and identify when maybe these populations might be in a little bit of trouble. So for instance, here I have highlighted, the decline of our Northwest moose population, which we identified with the survey and in combination with reports from field staff that work out in those areas of seeing fewer moose, seeing sick moose on the landscape, and also combined with reports from public similarly not seeing as many moose, seeing sick moose on the landscape. And so this survey, in combination with some of those field staff reports and reports from the public, can help us identify, again, when those populations might be getting into trouble. In the case of Minnesota moose, we've identified two major declines since the beginning of the survey, one in the Northwest, like I just mentioned, and the other people are maybe more recently familiar with, which is the decline of our moose population in Northeast Minnesota, where between 2007 and 2013, we saw about a 60% decline in the number of moose observed there, or that are in that population. It also helps us identify periods of stability, like we are in now, in that Northeast population and have been since probably about 2014. So the real value of these surveys is the longitudinal data set, that we can look at how that population is doing over time, not just from year to year, but over many years. So being able to survey these populations on an annual basis, identify when they might be getting into some trouble, can lead to research questions. So in this case, our questions were, what are the contributing factors in these declines? What is going on with these moose? And is there anything we can do to kind of mitigate what those contributing factors are, or improve something for these moose that can help them overcome what some of these challenges are that they're facing? So possible contributing factors that we've explored through several studies that I'll touch on now is whether or not it was a decline or change in the availability and quality of food, whether there was some kind of change in forest management or habitat over time, whether or not there's been some added challenges through parasites and disease, predation, hunting, and then climate change. So in response to the decline of moose in Northwest Minnesota, there was a large study that ran from 1995 to 2000, where VHF collars were put on these moose. So these aren't GPS collars, they predate those. And that's pretty much when you would see pictures of biologists holding big antennas and receivers out in the field, listening for a beep, essentially on a certain frequency. So it requires you to be in the field, either on the ground or in the air, listening for those collars' frequencies. So that was a mortality study in Northwest Minnesota utilizing VHF collars. During or right before the aerial survey in Northeast Minnesota indicated a decline, there was also a mortality study, again using VHF collars from 2002 to 2008. And then right at the tail end of that really steep decline in Northeast Minnesota, again, we switched and used GPS collars for an additional mortality study. So I'm going to get a little bit into the details of those studies and what the results were. But I want to mention that we're trying to understand cause-specific mortality of these moose in the different areas. So again, what are those factors that are contributing to the decline? When we look at stable or growing populations within core moose range throughout North America, so that would be Alaska and Canada, about an 8 to 12% mortality rate is pretty good. It means your population is doing okay, they're pretty stable or growing. The results of the studies in Northwest Minnesota in the late 90s and early 2000s, and then in Northeastern Minnesota in the early 2000s indicate nearly double the annual adult mortality rate not attributed to hunting. Although there is some hunting included in the Northeast study, as you can see from this pie chart. We were still hunting moose at a state level at that time. So there is some included here, but the reported percent decline or mortality rate here is non-hunting mortality. In both regions, primary causes of mortality were related to health. So disease, parasites, in the case of the Northwest, that also include some signs of malnutrition and starvation. And with suggested links to climate change in both studies, predominantly the impacts of warmer winters. So keep that in mind, because we found something slightly different in terms of warm temperatures and challenges to moose in the next study that I'm going to talk about. But just to point out here, in both areas, these moose are challenged or were challenged by disease and parasites predominantly. But I'd also note that there were a lot of unknowns with this 2002 to 2008 study. That's not for lack of design and work. Really, it tends to be a limitation of being able to get to those moose as soon as they die. Because as I mentioned, with VHF collars, you have to physically be in the field listening, either on the ground or from the air. And a lot of these moose you just weren't able to find on a daily basis. It's more like weekly or bi-weekly. And so if you're not able to get to them immediately upon death, it's harder to know what the cause of that mortality was. Okay, so that leads us to the most recent large-scale study that DNR took on before our present one, which was our GPS collared moose cause-specific mortality study. That study, again, was from 2013 to 2018, where the primary goal, again, was to understand what was causing cause-specific non-hunting mortality. So for that study, we captured and collared 173 moose from 2013 to 2015. We distributed those moose throughout Northeast Moose Range, and about 75% were females and 25% were males. Those moose were monitored with GPS collars until death or the project's end in 2018 when the collars were set to drop off. And the goal here to really try and get a good handle on what was killing these moose was to respond within 24 hours of death, and then when possible, extract a whole carcass, drive it down to Minneapolis to the veterinary diagnostic lab, or Minneapolis-St. Paul, and have a board certified veterinary pathologist perform a full necropsy and take a bunch of samples, send that in for analysis. If the whole carcass could not be extracted from the field, then special teams were specially trained on how to do necropsies in that field setting, collecting all the samples that would be needed for analysis at the veterinary diagnostic lab. Okay, so the results of that Northeast study are not too dissimilar from the results of the 2002 to 2008 study, in that it still indicated that our moose are challenged by health-related issues such as disease and infections. In this case, parasites, bacterial infection, and other things. But what we did manage to get here was a little bit more detail on what those health-related issues are. And so if we look at this slide here, you can see this is a representation in your upper left of the pie chart I just showed on the previous slide. What we saw, again, was that many of these animals were dying of health-related issues. Of the parasites, most moose died because they were infected with brainworm, which is carried by deer with no ill effect, but when infecting moose can cause death. Aside from brainworm, winter ticks were another leading cause of death when it came to those moose that died through parasites, liver flukes, and then some other parasitic infections. Of the moose that died from infection, which is another 20% of them, most of them died through wolf-related puncture wounds. So that means they had some encounter with a wolf where they survived initially, but then those bites became infected and they succumbed later. And then we had some other puncture wounds that caused death as well. Those could have been something like a stick or a fight with another bull and their antlers causing a puncture wound. And then, of course, other traumas related to that caused infection. But I think what's interesting here is that while we saw that 60 moose died as part of this study of the 173, 30% of those were confirmed or suspected wolf predation, but half of those, so half of that 30%, were predisposed to wolf predation. And by that, I mean they had some kind of underlying condition that would have weakened them and made them more vulnerable when they came into contact with those wolves, and more vulnerable then to predation by wolves. I would also note that these moose that died through wolf predation also tended to be older. And so when we think about predation on large species or any species, predators tend to predate more of the very young, the old, and the sick. And so we're seeing that represented in this adult population here, in that those animals that tend to be taken by wolves were on the older side and or were predisposed in some way and were sick. So also I would note here that distinguishing between that proximate cause, so that is the cause of death immediately, so that wolf being a good example of that. The animal was predated, so that immediate cause of death was wolf predation, versus the ultimate cause of death, which is what can lead up to that animal being at risk from those wolves. So again, being predisposed. Distinguishing between those is really, really difficult, even when you're able to respond within 24 hours. These moose aren't like us in that they don't have a full medical history. We get some information on their condition at capture, but then we don't really know their overall health until they manage to die within the study. And so it's really like wildlife CSI out there trying to figure out how and what contributed to the mortality of these animals beyond the proximate cause. All right. As I mentioned, we had some secondary goals trying to understand how these moose are responding to the extreme weather, mainly heat stress, as a part of this study. And that kind of comes out of previous studies indicating that climate change and warming environments could be contributing to some of the challenges that were experienced in Northwest moose and also before the first Northeast moose mortality study. So as a secondary goal, we wanted to evaluate what kind of physiological behavior and habitat use effects these warming temperatures, changing environments were having on moose. We were able to do that in a secondary subset of these moose. 41 of them, to be exact, were given Rubin boluses. So those are called mortality implant transmitters. Their primary purpose was to help with a more timely response to mortality events, because the collars, in order to send a mortality signal to us, need to be stationary for about 8 hours. But these mortality implant transmitters monitor whether or not the moose's heart was beating. So the moment that heart stopped beating, the mortality implant transmitter would communicate with the collar and say, hey, I'm dead. Collar sends us a signal and we can get out there more quickly. Secondarily, though, these mortality implant transmitters also collected internal temperature of these moose on a 10 or 15-minute record for the entire life of the study, or as long as it was in the moose. And that's what really allowed us to ask, how these moose are responding to external environmental conditions, particularly ambient temperature in different seasons. And so here on the bottom left, we have a graph that shows moose internal temperature relative to daily ambient temperature. And we see that some of those internal moose temperatures, especially in the spring, summer, and fall, are really, really high, less so in the winter relative to ambient temperature. We could also look at the behavioral impacts of these extreme temperature events, particularly, as I mentioned, ambient temperature, and what that means for the proportion of time that moose are spending resting versus foraging or versus walking across their landscape. And we can also look at those locations from the GPS collars relative to where they were on the landscape and see if there was any change in habitat use during these periods that were hot. So what we found is that these moose in Northeast Minnesota are getting hot, and they're getting hot fairly frequently. We measured over those 41 moose over several years, 10,724 hot moose events. And so that means a period of time where their internal temperature was elevated. And we broke that down into several different categories. So a moderate elevation of internal temperature and a severe, and then categories of the duration of time that their internal body temperature was elevated. And so as you can see, most of these moose had moderate increases in internal body temperature and for a short amount of time, but there were some significant amount of time where we saw severely elevated body temperatures and for longer periods of time. And what this means for these moose is that if they were hot more often, they were more likely to die. So that is our physiological response. More frequently hot moose had less likelihood of surviving than moose that were not frequently getting hot, which is pretty significant. What we also found is that there is a difference in behavior between those moose that are getting hot and the moose that are able to mitigate these hot temperatures. So, for instance, hot moose that are getting hot more often, are not acting like normal moose. Normal moose that aren't as hot were switching their behavior to more nocturnal foraging. We think they're spending more time in what we would consider foraging habitats at night when temperatures are elevated, or during periods of warm temperatures, I should say. Whereas those hot moose are not really making that nocturnal switch. And so a quote from our most recent paper that's just been accepted into wildlife biology is that, simply put, hot moose appear to be making bad choices in terms of habitat selection relative to their ability to thermoregulate in summer, which may be contributing to their lower survival. So we are seeing a physiological response for these moose, and we're also seeing a behavioral response to these moose. And we are also seeing that, you know, these things combined are potentially contributing to an increased likelihood of dying. All right. So now I'm going to move quickly into some of our new research that's going on. So we've just started a new study this past winter to look at juvenile recruitment and fecundity in this cohort of moose in Northeast Minnesota, or this population of moose, rather, sorry. As I mentioned, this is a project where we have multiple collaborators, and it is being co-led by Dr. Michelle Carsonson and the DNR and Morgan Swingen at 1854 Treaty Authority. And here you can see, again, that we are going to have this study area throughout for moose range, so distributing collars on juvenile moose throughout that range. Why focus on the juveniles? Well, there is a gap, a knowledge gap here. Past research has focused mainly on adults and also neonatal, so those would be the newborn calves, but we really haven't had much information collected on juveniles. So those would be those moose that are 8 to 10 months old to about 1.5 to almost 2 years old. We don't really know at what point they are becoming pregnant, and at what point, you know, how well those calves of those new mothers entering that population are surviving. So that's really an information gap we're looking to fill with this project. So our objective one is to capture and collar juvenile moose during their first winter. So again, when they're about 8 to 10 months old, they weigh about 400 pounds or so. They're still with the cow, but they are capable of living independently from her at that point. They're fully weaned. They're mobile. they are just still with her, because moose tend to stay with the cow until they're about 1 year of age. So again, the goal is capture 60 moose per year for 3 years. So we've just finished the first year this past winter, so we have 2 more years of capture. We want to capture each year about 2/3 female and 1/3 males. And then I will also note that the collars that are getting put on the females will last about 3 years, and for the males, 2 years. It's a shorter period of time that they'll last on the males, just because male necks will grow more than female necks, especially as they become reproductively mature and their necks expand during the rut. All the collars are fit with blow-off mechanisms and timed releases, so that those collars fall off as they're intended to at the end of the study. The other objective is to collect pellets that would let us run tests to determine pregnancy rates. So figure out when these moose are first becoming pregnant as they enter into the adult population, and at what rate. This work is being done by a PhD student at University of Minnesota Duluth named Taylor Vielander, and he's already been collecting data on this and has some promising results. Then objective 3, quickly, is to conduct aerial surveys with infrared imaging, again, the new tool that I'm going to talk about in a second, to determine how many calves are born to these collared moose and how many survived their first winter. So the timeline of determining this is winter, we go out, Taylor goes out, collects fecal pellets, determines that these juvenile moose that have, you know, become yearlings or 2-year-olds and become pregnant are pregnant. And then we look for a specific calving behavior in the spring. We fly this new plane, locate the moose, determine if she has a calf, and then do the same thing, locate the moose, determine if her calf is still there in late fall and early winter to look at calf survival. The outcomes of this project that we anticipate is that we'll be able to determine recruitment, survival, and the age of first reproduction of these young moose in northern Minnesota. provide data to improve moose population modeling, and then quantify habitat use of these young moose and determine how that relates to survival and reproduction. And then ultimately be able to hopefully inform some of our wildlife and habitat management strategies that can benefit this population in the future. So just quickly, I want to touch on our new tool that I'm really excited about and how we're going to be able to achieve objective 3 of the new project, is the Cessna 206 airplane that is outfitted with an MX-10 thermal infrared camera platform. So here we have a photo of the plane at the top. On the left is a photo of the cockpit that with multiple screens. So the pilot can kind of see not only what's in front of him, what we're doing, but also what we're seeing on our screens in the back seat. So in the back seat, which is called the TFO station, stands for Trained Flight Officer, there's 2 screens. One can show kind of the computer real-time GIS screen, and the other shows the camera. And you can overlay the 2 on one another. And then again, behind us, we have a retractable sensor mount. That's where the actual camera sits until we lower it and are actively using it. So, as I mentioned, there's a really specific behavior that moose show when they're about to give birth. Some moose, not all, will do what's called a long distance movement. And so when this line on the graph goes up or down, it's showing movement across the landscape. And when it's flat, as is indicated at the top here, that indicates a lack of movement across the landscape over time. And so what that means is that moose moved quite a few miles over several days and then just stopped moving. That is a pretty classic calving and pre-calving behavior for these moose. Like I said, not all will do a long distance move, but all will do this kind of stop and cluster, locate themselves in one particularly very small area, about an acre in area for up to 2 weeks after they give birth. So we can run algorithms that look at these data, identify these clusters, we can plot them on the landscape, and then we can fly to them. What this screen is showing is the location clusters of moose that have likely calved, and the blue lines are showing the path of the aircraft. And so all the circles are us orbiting around there, looking for the moose and then verifying she has a calf, counting how many calves she has. To end this quickly, I'm going to show a little bit of a video that we captured in spring 2025 of this calving flights. So this is the computer screen that we look at for these flights. It shows us our camera area viewed in the white square. And this is the camera view that we're actually seeing. What we do is load those location clusters onto the camera, and then we can point the camera to the location and geolocated point on landscape and begin searching for the moose. And so in a second here, we're going to switch back to the thermal infrared view, and you're going to see a moose pop up right under the green reticle there. That's the cow that we're looking for. She's not too far from the center of her location cluster. What we do then is set up an orbit. We're flying at about 1 mile line of sight away from these moose when we're first searching for them. And we're at about 4,000 feet elevation or altitude when we're flying. So this is a moose with a calf right behind her. The other hotspot to the lower center right of the screen is actually just a hot rock. But that is a moose in May of 2025. I will say that this day was about 75 degrees and our thermal infrared camera was still picking up these moose really well. Here we're showing a different moose that we found that day, reaching out and giving her calf a lick. And we are using a blend function in that screen that allowed us to see some color, but also still the thermal image of that moose. Again, another moose with calves here that day. She's under a cedar, and this one actually has twins. You can tell that this was a hot day because the calves are all sprawled out next to her. You'll see in a second. Is just keeping cool under that cedar. But we are super excited about how well this worked. Here we have twins standing up with the cow. We'll eventually see one of them go in and start nursing with her. But this worked really well, even in warm temperatures, in heavy conifer cover in most instances. And we're most excited in that we're flying at such an elevation and at such a distance here, 0.7 miles line of sight away from these animals that they don't even know we're there. So it's a really non-invasive way to verify that these moose have calved without disturbing them and causing some undue stress. And then just quickly, this is a moose from this spring. This is in collaboration with Grand Portage, I should mention, all this work finding these moose that have given birth. This particular moose has just had twins. And what we'll see at the top of the screen in a bit here is that her last year's calf is also still with her. She's trying to boot it away. That's typical behavior. They kick out the previous year's calves so that they can give birth and focus on the new calves. And so in the upper right of the screen, you see that yearling kind of a little bit unwilling to leave at the moment. We're switching back and forth between infrared and daylight camera to try and see if we can see the calves, which we can't through those alder and willow, but also because we noticed that there was quite a bit of hair loss on this moose due to winter ticks. And so we were trying to get some good images of that hair loss. This moose is doing fine. It didn't succumb to those winter ticks, but it was quite a bit of hair loss, and that was not uncommon in moose we were able to see this spring. So we're going to keep building this method. We'll use it for the next several years of this study. And again, we will also be searching not only for the newborns, but also in the fall and early winter to see if those calves have survived. So with that, I'll just thank everyone for your time and mention again, if you do want more information on this new juvenile moose study, Dr. Michelle Carstensen and Morgan Swingen are the folks to contact, but I'm also happy to answer any questions you might have. And if you want to check out more about that particular study, I would recommend going to moosealliance.org. I believe a link to that will be shared in the chat.
Amanda, thank you so much for the presentation. That was fascinating. I love the new camera I've used. That's super cool. So I love it when we can use technology for natural things and studying our natural world rather than sitting in a small little box staring at a phone. So
Absolutely.
we have several questions. We'll see if we can get to as many of these as we can. I'm going to start with one. I think we talked about it a little bit beforehand, but somebody brought up, it has a good memory, talking about collaring moose when we were using VHF collars, and they curtailed that when the population dropped, thinking it might be placing stress on the smaller animals or whatnot. And he was wondering if you could comment on that a little bit.
The question is whether collaring them with VHF collars was placing undue stress on them.
Yeah, and causing the decline, or
if we're referring to the adult study, I would say I don't recall that being a reason for curtailing that study in terms of just the collar itself causing stress on the animals. Those are weighted such that they shouldn't cause any stress, but I think probably they're referring to the actual capture process having an impact. And so sometimes, yes, moose unfortunately can become injured or die during this process. We do not want that to happen. And we do everything within our control to think of situations where we might avoid putting the undue stress on them and avoid that kind of event happening. We also, so yes, we have experienced some of that in the past in these studies. And we have taken I think, comprehensive look at how to prevent things like that from happening again to the best of our ability. So putting in place protocols that would take, if something goes wrong, take a pause, figure out what happened, determine how to move forward so that, you know, that situation isn't encountered again, or, you know, potentially pausing the part of capture, adjusting a drug protocol, looking at placing restrictions on how long an animal can be pursued for that capture. And so while we have experienced some capture related mortalities in the past, we have done, I think, a really good job of implementing protocols in this current study that do as good a job as we can as at trying to prevent something like that to happen again. Now, that said, we can't anticipate every single situation. And so unfortunately, sometimes we, you know, may still experience some capture related mortality. But again, we have, I think, a set of really good standards and thresholds and protocols to try and mitigate as much of that as possible, because it's the last thing we want to do. We want these animals to live. But good question.
Yep. A couple other questions on the aircraft, so I'm going to combine these two, but one of them was the altitude restrictions over the boundary waters and how that influences the effectiveness of aerial surveys. And the other question was the difference between fixed wing and helicopter surveys and why the change of methods.
Sure. So to talk about restrictions quickly, for the helicopter survey, we have an agreement with the Forest Service to fly at a normal altitude over the boundary waters for that survey. So we communicate with them regularly to be able to fly at low altitudes for that survey for the particular blocks in that year. And so that doesn't really have an impact on how we perform the survey within the boundary waters. But I would also mention for this new plane that we hope eventually we'll be able to use for this survey, because it does a really good job at picking moose out. It's really efficient. We'll be flying at such an altitude that we would be above those restrictions. And so it would be even less of a concern and have less impact on the survey potentially. And the second part of that question, could you remind me? Oh, why the switch?
Yep, switch from aircraft to helicopters or vice versa.
Right. So the reason for a switch from airplane to helicopter was that you can fly, obviously, a helicopter very differently from a fixed wing airplane, such that you can fly at slower speeds, slightly lower altitudes, and you can circle slower around groups. And so the thought is that you get a better ability to observe moose using helicopter. So that was why that switch was made. But technology continues to advance, and we're looking at the potential switch back, not immediately, but over several years of testing, to using a fixed wing, particularly with this new camera, just because the camera is so good at picking out those white hot moose on the landscape, particularly in winter when we have a cold background. So it's just, the reason is just, as technology advances, we make these switches to try and improve our ability to accurately and precisely count moose to feed into our population model.
Great. And again, everybody, we're not going to be able to get to all the questions today. We got a lot of them coming in, but the phone numbers and email addresses are on the screen there. Amanda, if you want to pull those down whenever you're ready, we can do that. So
sure.
Thanks everybody for joining us. One question that came in that's I'm kind of interested in, because it's recent events here. The thermal cow calf capability is amazing of that new camera, and glad we're looking after the moose. Have you lost any collared moose in the fires up north, and will the fires eventually improve moose habitat, you think?
Good questions. That's something we've been looking at. Right now, most of the moose that we have collared were collared outside of the boundary waters, and so they are not really in the line of fire of the current wildfires. We have one but they are staying outside of the fire boundary pretty well. And so we haven't lost any of our study animals, the ones that we can actually track with the collars to these fires. And the second part is, will it eventually improve habitat for these moose? And the answer there is yes, it should. So what these fires are doing is essentially setting this forest back to an earlier stage. So it makes it, when it starts to regenerate, it becomes young forest. It has an abundance of good, high quality forage available to these moose. One thing we would also want to consider is that we hope that some stands are left that would, especially some of those low conifer stands that would provide cover for those moose and intersperse it with some of that new high quality vegetation that regenerates post fire.
Great. I had a couple tick questions for you. You mentioned winter ticks in the presentation. Do you expect them to become more likely to cause issues in coming years? And has that issue, I guess, increase? And then another question was, we give our dogs tick medicine and stuff. Is there any shots when you're capturing moose that you can give them to help prevent some of the diseases?
Okay, so do we expect that winter ticks might become more of an issue? Potentially. So ticks, winter ticks in particular, have a little bit of a different life cycle than, say, like our deer ticks and wood ticks, in that they do their feeding in the winter. So they're on the moose, they're taking their blood meals over winter, and then they fall off in the spring. So if they fall off onto snow cover, fewer of them survive. If they fall off onto bare ground or into the duff, more survive. And so then you see an uptick in ticks the following year. And then you can see in the next spring, higher tick loads and more hair loss due to those ticks. So the higher the tick load, the more likely you see that hair loss and potential for hypothermia or anemia just because of blood loss. And then, yeah, so if we have earlier springs, we have less consistent snow into the later spring, you could see how tick populations could continue to increase over time, especially because they are also related to deer. So if you have an increase in deer populations, increase in tick populations, you could see it becoming more of an issue. And in fact, it is a big issue in northeastern United States, in states like New Hampshire and Vermont and Maine. Mm-hmm. The second part was about treatment.
Oh, yeah.
We get this question a lot. It's not really practical to treat these moose. We're collaring so few of the moose that are within this large population. And it's not an efficient means of really treating an entire population for preventing tick. And so the better way would be to try and reduce tick loads through maybe prescribed fire or something like that. Other habitat management measures.
Okay. And we have one very observant person who was talking about your range maps that you were showing towards the beginning of the presentation. It says the range maps showed that moose were absent from the arrowhead when caribou were present. Was that because the browse favored by moose is absent prior to the logging of the 19th and early 20th century?
In part, yeah. So that part of the arrowhead pre-settlement, pre-wide scale logging probably favored more mature, old growth conifer that would provide food for caribou and less food for moose. That doesn't mean moose weren't there. It just wasn't part of their primary range. And so moose will tend to follow early successional habitats around the landscape. So if you had some sort of natural disturbance within that range, you would, open it up for moose use. But yeah, like landscape use change pre-settlement, in addition to hunting and moving in of deer that also carry disease that have a negative impact on caribou. Also, brainworm is one of them. probably contributed to that extirpation of caribou and then the allowed movement of moose, yeah, with the creation of younger forest.
Great. I know we're just a little bit over time already, so I think we'll cut it off there. If I didn't get to your question, I apologize. Please reach out and we'll see if we can get answers for you. Again, if you don't see those or didn't write those email addresses down, you're more than welcome to reach out to me too. So thank you for joining us today, and really look forward to learning more about the moose study and how this plays out over the next several years. And thank you everybody for joining us today. We'll see you in a couple weeks. We're going to be talking about ducks in Minnesota here in a couple weeks. So get outside, stay safe, and bring somebody new to the outdoors outside with you, and enjoy a little bit more of the summer heat. So thanks everyone, and have a safe couple weeks outside.